In this session, we want to explore how climate change induced hazards like floods and heat waves are increasingly affecting our cities, and what we can do to prepare for such events and build resilient urban communities. My name is Cecilia Schmelzer. I'm a senior officer for urban preparedness and response at the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, and seconded to this position by the German Red Cross. IFRC and German Red Cross and also other Red Cross national societies are investing quite a lot to build capacities to be better prepared for humanitarian assistance in urban contexts, because we see that cities are increasingly affected and that humanitarians are confronted with new and additional challenges when working in urban areas, but also that these contexts do provide new opportunities for building preparedness and resilience and scaling up our efforts. For those of you who might have been listening into this conference over the past 2 days, you might have heard Martin Griffith, the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, yesterday in his keynote in the panel. He said that climate change is the biggest crisis we are facing. And I think that is quite a statement in the face of the war in Ukraine and other wars in the world and all the other problems we have. But he really mentioned climate change as absolutely the biggest challenge that we are facing. And also that climate change is a threat multiplier and exacerbates already existing vulnerabilities and compromises development. This came up in several of the panel discussions over the last couple of days. And a number of high-level speakers also emphasized the need to focus more on anticipatory action and preparedness. And for this, also the contributions of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Climate Center, as well as the Anticipation Hub, were mentioned. So I think we are all very much aware of climate change and what that means, leading to more extreme weather events, such as cyclones and floods and heat waves and droughts. And we want to focus particularly on floods and heat waves in this session. And of course, also the focus on urban areas. Why urban areas? You might think that most of those natural events rather would affect the rural areas. But basically what we see and what we all know is that more than half of the global population now already lives in cities, and those numbers are increasing. And it seems at the same time that urban populations in general think that cities are safer and that they might not be as much affected by the adversities of climate change. But unfortunately, that is not the case, actually even to the contrary. And this is due to a number of reasons. Some of them, for example, many cities are traditionally built in areas like coastal areas, river deltas, on river banks, which used to be safe at the time, but are now becoming increasingly hazardous because of rising sea levels, because of floods, storm surges, etc. And then, of course, rapid urbanization also leads to situations where the infrastructure development of those cities cannot keep up with the pace that cities are growing. So in consequence, many cities rely on old or underdimensioned supply systems, and especially informal settlements often expand without any basic services like water and sanitation, which then, of course, produce precarious conditions for the people living there. And at the same time, people in cities are highly dependent on urban infrastructures and services, and people have low capacity to help themselves. I mean, this is quite obvious. If electricity is down, it's not the individual that will be able to fix this problem or do something about it. So in consequence, the breakdown or failure of any of those systems, be it electricity, be it the transport, be it water supply, have cascading effects on all the other systems and affect all the urban populations, not only the most vulnerable, which of course are always the most affected, but really it is affecting all people. And then at the same time, in addition to that, larger cities actually compound and exacerbate the risk of flooding, especially and heat waves, just because the built up areas and the sealed surfaces, they don't allow the rainwater to drain. If the drainage infrastructures are not dimensioned for unprecedented rainfalls, which is obviously difficult to dimension for something unprecedented. And then at the same time also all these surfaces of concrete and asphalt, they capture the heat. So that basically turns, in an extreme heat event, turns the city into an oven or an overdimensioned radiator, so to speak. And that is a threat that has not yet been acknowledged enough, I guess, because in recent years, extreme heat events have caused thousands of casualties and severely affected health conditions, predominantly in cities and urban populations. And that is, just to emphasize, it's really happening around the world. It is not only in tropical climate zones, but we see that also in moderate and cold climates. But there is also some good news, and that is that floods and heat waves are actually both quite predictable and foreseeable events. And that means that to a large extent, we can actually mitigate the adverse effects of those events by being well prepared and building resilient communities. And so, yeah, as I mentioned already in the beginning, it seems that that urban populations and even city governments are not maybe enough aware of these hazards that can affect them in their cities. And that's why oftentimes we see cities are not prepared as much as they could or they should be to actually resist those kind of events. So therefore, in this session, we will analyze some examples of humanitarian response, as well as anticipatory action towards climate change-induced hazards, floods and heat waves. And we'll try to understand better the perspective of both humanitarians as well as city governance and urban planning towards disaster risk reduction, preparedness, and to build resilience and prevent worst-case urban disaster scenarios from materializing. So to explore these thoughts further, I'm joined by an excellent panel, which you can see here around me. We have Reinhold Erdt. He is the operations manager at the German Red Cross, and he will provide some direct experience and analysis of the German Red Cross response to unprecedented floods that we saw last summer. We have Catalina Jaime. She is the head of Climate and Conflict Unit at the Red Cross and Red Cross Crescent Climate Center, and she will illustrate how anticipatory action can help to reduce the adverse effects of heat waves. And finally, we have Katrin Brübach, Global Director of Programs, Innovation and Impact, and from the Resilient Cities Network, and she will provide us with the perspective of urban governments and urban planning towards cities' resilience. And I also don't want to forget Fitzem Gelaye, who is supporting us behind the scenes as our Slido moderator. And I think you can all see on your screens, if you're joining through the swap card, where you can put in questions and answers. We will collect questions in the Slido throughout the whole presentations, and then we will pick up the questions at the end of the session. So without further ado, I would like to call on Reinhold to please bring up his presentation and yes, and share your thoughts. Welcome, Reinhold.
Thank you, Cecilia. Hello, everybody. A very important introduction and very important words. I will start my presentation by giving an overview about the situation of last summer, the flood response operation of the German Red Cross in the urban context, and then try to showcase lessons learned from this ongoing support. Also including different steps we are taking to reduce risks. I'm currently again involved in a humanitarian operation here in Germany, supporting the city of Berlin and welcoming Ukrainian guests at the former airport of Berlin-Tegel. And interestingly enough, we are again challenged with particularities of the urban context, questions of infrastructure and resilience. But let's jump right in. This map shows an excerpt of the Ahr Valley, with the city of Ahrweiler, roughly 28,000 inhabitants on the right side. Heavy rainfall in a short amount of time, combined with a narrow valley in which the city and the river are snugged into, resulted in this particular devastating flood. The homes of tens of thousands of people were directly affected. As you can see on this map, this is just a couple days after the flood, and yellow marks potentially damaged houses, orange marks damaged roads. And it just becomes clear that in this region alone, more than 40,000 people urgently needed basic assistance. Complete restoration of infrastructure, buildings, etc. will take many years. While we go through the different areas of emergency response, I think you will all understand why this particular flood scenario in an urban setting made a substantial response necessary. And difficulties and preliminary lessons learned, including one example of a new strategic direction the Red Cross is taking, will be included in the last slides. The flood destroyed all terrestrial communication along the Aar River. Mobile communication collapsed because power supply was no longer available. Feeder lines were destroyed. We were faced with a very unclear situation. What of the infrastructure still works? What does not? Where are the problems? And so we decided to build up our own communications networks with internet access for both our units and the people affected. We also put in place massive generators at neuralgic points to ensure local power supply and lighting. The generators have also been deployed to support critical infrastructure in the region. For example, deployed at the German Red Cross nursing home to supply it with electricity in order to prevent the evacuation of people living there. Another aspect of the response was that after the flood, there was no gas, electricity, as I mentioned, or any appliances for the affected population to prepare food. We saw in our response, we saw makeshift stoves, we saw catering from nearby unaffected cities, support through prepacked daily rations, but there was not one homogeneous approach to consistent quality food. So we decided to implement a food preparation center where we prepared hot and cold meals, lunch packages for over 10,000 people per day and over a longer period of time. Food was distributed at 55 distribution points. We distributed roughly 1 million meals over these days until existing infrastructure was repaired and other actors could take over. Destroyed infrastructure, and again, the particularity of the urban context, I think, was that in this destroyed infrastructure, also doctors' offices were affected, rescue stations, pharmacies, and other aspects and assets of healthcare. While at the same time, we saw a stark increase in the need for medical support, not only in the immediate aftermath of the flooding, but also then in the weeks to come, looking at infectious diseases, the spreading of other sicknesses along the region just because of the lack of sanitation infrastructure and the lack of health facilities. So we decided to deploy 4 mobile medical care units, as you can see on the left side in the picture, to ensure a basic medical care, including emergency pharmacies. We supported local emergency services by building rescue stations on containerized solutions, supplying them with energy and everything needed. We also distributed hygiene kits, protective clothing, information material on protection against infectious diseases, and also gave tetanus prophylaxis shots, as well as corona vaccination. Another aspect of this health response was the distribution of almost 3 million liters of drinking water at different dispensing points and the operation of washing and shower containers. A first for us in Germany was the installation of a temporary sewage treatment plant. Because of the widespread destruction of infrastructure, wastewater flowed untreated into the Aar River in many places. So this is an essential service that we were able to provide as well. The temporary sewage treatment plant was originally designed for international use and is now being set up the first time in Germany. We have 2 plants up and running, and a third is being built in the region. And this just is to show that in general, we had to deal with a multitude of interconnected challenges, all stemming from this very narrow area, a lot of dense population areas, and the sheer damage. So we were faced with damage and needs assessment. The situational overview was quite difficult to get, how many people were impacted and where exactly. There was a lack of knowledge of the affected population. With bigger cities, not everybody knows their neighbors, so we couldn't just go around and ask, okay, is there anyone else that needs support? That was not such an issue in smaller towns where everybody knew one another. We also had to deal with a multitude of different actors, from local authorities to spontaneous individual volunteers, NGOs, the federal states, armed forces. Different actors with different focus areas were all present on the ground, including problems then stemming from chain of command, responsibilities, double work, misunderstandings. This magnitude of actors also might also be a result of the urban context, because we needed specialized actors for specialized tasks. Dangerous infrastructure needed clearing, oil spills, chemical spills, dangerous other chemicals, which only specialized actors can provide, which then made this, or created this magnitude of different actors. And evidently, the destroyed infrastructure was a massive challenge. There was quite a high standard of living. That also means a high dependency on infrastructure. After the flood, there was not one bridge left that was safe to cross the river. Parts of communities were just cut off and not reachable. Technical support needed to gain access. We also saw that in our response, we had to rely on smaller vehicles to access areas, because the roads right next to the river were destroyed. So we had to actually go up the mountain and deal with a gradient of 35% of more very particular aspects of this operation. Accessibility and mobility were key areas that we tackled from the beginning. And again, urban context also meant that the centralized infrastructure used by many people in one single location, such as wastewater system, was destroyed, needing, as I mentioned, this temporary sewage treatment plant. So where do we go from here? In general, we need to strengthen civil protection for future challenges. That has become clear. We need to adapt it to future crises, including sustainable funding for future-oriented preparedness, stockpiling, infrastructure, and volunteer support. We also need to, again, even more take into account different vulnerabilities of population groups in Germany and new challenges these vulnerable people might face due to climate change, pandemics, and other scenarios. We need to convince people that climate change has arrived in Germany and has unexpected catastrophic impacts on everyone. Cecilia, you mentioned that in general, floods, you know when they might happen, and people living in this region were actually prepared for floods and for high tides, but not a flash flood like we saw last summer. They were just not prepared for that. People living in cities might realize that it's getting hotter and hotter, but maybe they don't link it to their own particular vulnerabilities. So we need to convince people of these aspects as well. We also need to enhance disaster risk reduction and resilience mechanisms. We need to leverage synergies from the international and national sectors and encourage networking across the board. This is why now the German Red Cross is also piloting anticipatory action, a tool used with positive impact in international humanitarian response operations, also within Germany. So that is something that is a direct consequence from this. We are also supporting the resilience strategy process of the United Nations, the Sendai framework for DRR, to reduce existing risks and again, look at particular vulnerabilities. We also need to establish new mechanisms and stronger funding for preparedness. The provision of time-critical bottleneck resources must be diversified and deployed nationwide in Germany, and then embedded in a holistic national management system. And one example on how we want to tackle this, on how we want to achieve this, is the so-called Laborbetreuung 5000, a pilot project for developing a national emergency shelter capacity for up to 5,000 people. And this pilot project is intended to be expanded upon so that we have a final capacity of 10 sites throughout Germany with a total number of 50,000 people. The idea of the module is to cover all basic needs and then be deployed independent and self-sufficient. That is why we have everything from energy supply, shelter, medical aspects, social care, all aspects that are needed to care for people that are affected by these kind of scenarios in a holistic way. And a particularity of this project is the adaptation of civil protection with regard to the different vulnerabilities of population groups in Germany and their resilience to catastrophes in urban settings. And the need for such a tool is clear as, again, we have a current response operation in Berlin-Tegel, where the German Red Cross headquarters has again deployed capacities of this Laborbetreuung 5000 to support the city of Berlin welcoming Ukrainian guests. We have activated shelter solutions and support with mobile medical facilities at the former airport of Berlin-Tegel. And here we are faced with different scenarios to the Ahr Valley, but we can see similarities where our experience now helps us. As the former airport is offline since more than 1.5 years, infrastructure, water, sanitation, waste management, wastewater has not been maintained. And we are again faced with a situation where we have to deploy self-sufficient solutions. That means we are now bringing our own electricity. We are building sewage tanks because the wastewater system is overloaded. And we have, again, to rely on stockpiled material as supply chains are still overstretched and disrupted. And with this, I know this has been a lot of information in a short time. I'm looking forward to your questions, and I'm handing back over to you, Cecilia. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Reinhold, for these fascinating insights to very practical challenges. And I just want to flag and just highlight, I mean, I think it's almost out of the book, let's say, example where all the different sectors are affected and everything has to be dealt with. But then let's look at the scale. This was only a rather small city compared to what we see globally. Once this kind of event happens in a city over 1 million people, it's unimaginable how these situations can actually be dealt with. And a lot more of preparedness is really necessary to be even just little bit prepared. So the scale of things is really something to take into account. What I picked up also from Reinhold's presentation is the need for better coordination. I mean, he mentioned all those different actors, some very experts, highly expert type of interventions, but also very general. So the need for all those different stakeholders to work together and someone to coordinate that. That seems to be something that is appearing again and again in emergency operations that I've also been part of. And also, I think the aspect of time is sometimes underrated. We often, especially as humanitarians, we think rather short term, but as we have seen here, like if infrastructure is destroyed to that extent, it takes years and years to rebuild it. And in the meanwhile, some kind of support systems still have to be functioning. So how to deal with that? And then, of course, as Reinhold also really highlighted, is the awareness of populations and their ability to help themselves. And especially when we're looking at larger scale and more people affected, I think it's absolutely critical that people are more enabled to also help themselves or to know at least what they can do to improve the situation. So thank you again very much, Reinhold. And I think with that, we want to jump directly into a totally different context, heat waves, but which also comes with its own challenges and threats. So Catalina, I will ask you to please share your presentation and give us your thoughts.
Thank you. So hi, everyone, and thanks, Cecilia, for inviting me. I'm really delighted to be able to talk about this very important hazard that many times is really ignored. in which we are not really prepared for it. I think, Reynold, you mentioned that in the case of Germany, you were prepared for floods, but not for flash floods. And I think that's the same thing with heat waves, no? Where we're really prepared for certain hazards that we're very used to. But in the case of heat waves, it is really one of those hazards that we know is a silent killer, no? But we're not really, from a humanitarian perspective, to be able to anticipate it, to manage it, and to protect the communities that are like really susceptible to be impacted by it. So before I go into the details, I just wanted to share a little bit, like what the Climate Center is, because sometimes for not maybe a lot of people that is in this event, might be a little bit confusing of the like Climate Center. What do we do? So within the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, the Climate Center has the role of supporting every single national society in the world and the Federation and the ICRC and the wider humanitarian system on advancing knowledge to be able to do climate risk management. So we really focus on advancing research, investing on like understanding more and more certain particular priority topics, to translate that into information and knowledge that could be applied in the ground, but also to influence policy changes that will enable us to make the big transitions that we need to do towards better climate action. So within all the work that we do, one of the priority topics is heat and extreme heat, because we know clearly that it is one of the most like complex hazards that will produce many humanitarian impacts, like now, as we're already seeing, and in the future. So in these 10 minutes that I have, I would like to share two things with you. Like one is like why heat waves are important. So I'm going to share with you like some of the science and the information that we have behind this, but also what could we do from a humanitarian perspective and what could be our responsibilities in all this process. So I'm going to get started with something very relevant for us, which is a piece of information that was like published a couple of 2020 by the Lancet Countdown, which is one of the most important medical journals in the world. And this statistic here is like really striking. So you can see clearly that in the last 20 years, we have seen an increase of like 54% increase of heat-related deaths in older people globally. So it is not only older people that is extremely impacted and susceptible to heat waves, but we also have like children, workers that are outside, and many other people that already have underlying health conditions. One of the very of heat waves is our current disaster management systems and hospital data report, and really attribute the mortality or morbidity waves particular hazards. These are structures that we need to overcome, even on the data management attribution of these or morbidity, to be able to that it like particular severity is due to heat. The fact that we have this analysis from the government is important because we didn't really have that before. Something very important as well, which is not only of the impact on people, but also the economic impact that we're seeing of heat waves are extreme. So as you can see in the example that I have here, like in India, like there was a calculation of the economic impact of the heat waves, and it's billions and billions that are basically costing in daily hours of people that are not able to work because of heat waves. So this really, it's like an eye-opening for us to think, well, I mean, then what can we do? I mean, what is our position as humanitarians to be able to deal with these situations? Now, something that is very important with relation to climate change is that there have been more and more studies that actually attribute certain particular heat waves to climate change. So there is very concrete scientific evidence that is demonstrating that certain particular events like the Japan 2018 heat wave that actually is attributed to climate change. So this is like a few years ago, like imagine 10 years ago, it was really difficult to attribute particular events to climate change. But now the science has advanced, and we are actually able to set in reality this heat wave is really due to the of climate change. And this was actually seen, and I would imagine that many of you saw the news last year of what happened in the United States in the Pacific Northwest heat wave. The temperatures that part of the world had were out of the chart. They really went beyond anything we have seen before. And this is not only happening in this area, is happening in many other places. We have seen this in Pakistan. We have seen in India. We have seen it in many other places where people that is very likely to be impacted live. And this is really a very important thing for all of us as humanitarians, because we know that this hazard is happening. And we know that we have a lot of people that is extremely vulnerable to be impacted by it. So now the question is like, what can we do? And from a research perspective, what we see at the moment is that most of the heat-related research is conducted actually in the global north. So we have a lot of information, for instance, on heat waves impacts in Europe. Particularly, many of you might remember in 2003, there was a really bad heat wave that killed around more than 6,000 people in Europe. So from that moment, there was a lot of investment of research on trying to understand better the impacts. Some of the cities in Europe actually that has developed already very good heat action plans. But if we think about what happened with the rest of the world, what are the impacts and what are the susceptibility, we don't have much of information. So one important call for all of us is we need to understand better the risks of heat in the areas where we work. So it's not only about doing the action, but investing in actually understanding those particular risks. So that's one key thing that we definitely need to be looking at. Now, in the Climate Center and with the Federation, we have been working quite a lot on trying to understand what is the role of us as a Red Cross, and particularly the local branches. What can we do to be able to anticipate, to reduce these risks? So we have two really fantastic documents that I would really welcome you to go and check out. It is one of the most beautiful and really concrete guidelines that we have on how to manage heat waves in cities and really at local level, small type of cities. It really has a lot of details of examples of type of assessments, everything that you might need to be able to use that. And this could apply to any humanitarian organization of the world, not only to the Red Cross. And actually, what is very important is that this is a way to open up discussions with city government units to identify, from our side, how we can collaborate with these government units to jointly make the different plans for preparedness, for risk reduction, for anticipation of heat waves. So I really welcome you. I hope that somebody is copying the link, maybe in a Slido or somewhere else, so you can check that out. Now, let's think about, why heat waves somehow, it is extremely impactful hazard, but at the same time, it is kind of relatively straightforward to reduce the risks. So in this, I really would like you to look at the whole extent of climate risk management and climate smart programming. So this is not just one single solution will reduce risk, but it's really the combination of different factors. So we can do investments in the long term. So you can see, for example, this picture on the top, which is basically something that was created in South Africa as a kind of park, a water park in the city for people to have access in summer, just to basically cool themselves. So we're talking about really urban planning and change of infrastructures, like other like really important change of infrastructure that need to happen in cities is even the way how we construct, or others construct buildings and houses to really make them like really prepare to deal with heat waves. Like in the case of Europe, for instance, like houses are fantastically built for winter, but are they really built for summer? They are not necessarily, no. And they create actually the opposite effect of creating that heat effect inside of the houses. Now, from a more humanitarian perspective, no, like in our scope of work, there is a lot that could be done. So there are like really fantastic examples, for instance, in the Netherlands, where there are like campaigns to go and visit elderly people during a heat wave to make sure that they are safe, like really monitoring of the most like people likely to be impacted. In India, the India Red Cross did amazing awareness campaigns during heat waves with volunteers just to tell people the key messages of what they can do, where they need to go, just to drink water as a very simple risk reduction action. So there's plenty of things that we could do, and in the guidelines that I share, you have a lot of material for inspiration. Now, just looking into the role of anticipatory action in this process. So what is one of the measures to be able for us as humanitarian agencies to be able to support the reduction of this mortality or morbidity is the setup of anticipatory action systems, which basically means that if we have a forecast that tell us clearly that certain particular population is very likely to be impacted in a particular location, and if we have that piece of information, which is we can have that, and we do have a plan that clearly says how can we reduce certain risk, what are the actions that make sense to do in different type of context. And then we have the financing aspect that will enable us to implement those actions. Then we have the perfect combination that will enable us to do anticipatory action. So we're very fortunate somehow that during the last couple of years, the different agencies, humanitarian agencies, from like the Red Cross to the UN to the START network, have developed these financing mechanisms to enable all of us to actually be able to anticipate these type of heat wave related disasters. And now the key responsibility somehow that many of us have is to develop those plans. We need to understand risk. We need to like really invest on identifying who is more likely to be impacted, where and how. We need to understand, for instance, what could be the impact of a heat wave on an IDP population living in a refugee camp in Syria, and what could be the impact of a heat wave on a city in Nigeria. So this really deep analysis is something that is a collective responsibility for all of us to be able to develop these anticipatory action systems. We have all the ingredients of the cocktail to be able to do it, but I think it's a responsibility of us and donors to do the investment and to prioritize this so we can really be ready to respond and anticipate and respond to any type of heat wave that happens. So there is plenty of amazing materials that we have developed, and many other organizations already have developed, that could be used everywhere just to share with communities, to make sure that everybody knows the basic things that could be done, because sometimes people don't even realize that the heat wave can actually affect them. So these communication campaigns are extremely useful. So we were very happy to share a lot of this information with you. And with that, Cecilia, I'm going to pass over to you. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you very much indeed, Catalina. Yeah, very illustrative and interesting insights into anticipatory action against heat waves. And I understand that really, as you said, we have data, but not enough research to really understand what that data could mean, like the weather data, and then how to actually make those projections. And then, of course, and that's a matter of really sharing the data and having good data management. But then, of course, the action that needs to follow. And as you mentioned, we have these forecast-based financing systems now in place that actually allow for activities to take place before the disaster happened, which hasn't been the case before. We had always had to wait until something happened, until funds would be released. Now with this forecast-based financing and anticipatory action models, we can actually act before that, which is really a good thing, but needs to be widened and increased in scope. But I'm also a little bit aware of the time, so I do want to give the floor directly to Katrin to share her presentation with us. Please, Katrin.
Thank you so much. And I have to go back. So thank you so much for having me today and giving me the chance to talk a little bit about the work we are doing. Just for everybody to be clear, I am going to try very hard to lift you out a little bit from the disaster risk reduction angle, to lift you a little bit away also from the risks and vulnerabilities and specific shocks we heard about, being it a flood or a heat wave, to try to put it into the context of how we are working with cities to build resilience, to be better prepared, but a lot more to the effects of extreme weather. So I'm working for the Resilient Cities Network. We are a city network with 97 cities around the world. We are supporting our cities in building urban resilience, and we are city-led. So we are guided by a global steering committee. We are regionally driven, meaning that we have offices on several continents, and we are working with partners and are very much focused to create impact on the ground. So what does that mean? What does resilience mean in the context? What does resilience mean in the urban context if we are trying to move away a little bit from the Sendai framework and the disaster risk reduction angle, which is an important part, but we tend to look a little bit wider at it. So the definition we are working with our cities is that resilience is defined as the capacity of individuals, communities, institutions, businesses, and systems to survive, adapt, and grow, no matter what kind of chronic stresses and acute shocks they experience. So a city for us is a system that consists of multiple other systems, like the water system, the electricity system, but it's also considered depending on the people who live in the city, the communities who live in the city, and the institutions and businesses they make up the city. And all these different moving bits and parts make a city a very complex system in itself, which means that if whatever is happening to the city has multiple impacts, and that's why we are seeing, and that's what we heard also from Cecilia and from Reinhold and also Catalina, that the more things happening in one place, the larger the impact usually is if something happens. We are looking at resilience from a perspective of chronic stresses. Chronic stresses are certain things that impact the functionality or the fabric of a city on a constant basis. And usually these stresses have a very, very important aspect on how a sudden shock impacts the city. So, and that relates to what we see. If we have a heat wave and we have a lot of old people living in a city, the casualties or the impact on the population may be higher. The same if we have large, and we have seen that in Europe during the heat waves as well, if we have a large vulnerable population, meaning people who are crowded in small places in affordable housing, or if we are going to the African context and we see that we have a lot of people living in floodplains, which is a sign for poverty in these areas, a shock like a flood or an earthquake or whatever can have devastating impacts. So we believe that if we think about resilience and disaster response, we need to think about what are the things that weaken a city in the onset, and what is the impact we have. And that very much relates to what Catalina said about we need to know who is how vulnerable, where are the risks when we plan for that. So why does resilience matter? I think the issue is, and I don't want to go into detail because we heard a lot. We have massive urbanization going on. If we're looking to Africa and Southeast Asia, there are a lot of problems that are going to happen in the future with a lot of people be crowded in specific places. we are coming out, or we are still not there, out of a global pandemic, which had a massive impact on cities in that sense that people were pushed back into poverty. So the vulnerabilities in our cities are increasing, and we are seeing, because of climate change, that cities are much more vulnerable to natural disasters, and that will have a massive impact. And I think we need to talk about that. We, as we are sitting on this call, are not going to solve that. There's a lot of money and investment needed, and cities will have to drive that investment into infrastructure, into being prepared, but also into not only being prepared to what is going to happen, but to build the services and the infrastructure for the people that will live there. And that means 75% of the infrastructure we will need by 2050 has not been built. And that doesn't even consider something that is being lost through disasters. So as I said, I'm trying to lift you a little bit out of the urban heat and the flooding conversation, because cities are not only saying I'm focusing on urban heat or I'm focusing on flooding. Cities are actually thinking about 1,000 different things. And what we have seen that in the work with our cities when we were preparing resilient strategies together with them is that they prioritize in a very different manner. And it's important to understand that cities prioritize and then put money behind that, and resources and capacity. So no matter if we come to them and tell them you need to prioritize urban heat, if they have another 6 different priorities, if it's storms, or if it's disease outbreaks, or if it's cyber attacks, they will focus on what they perceive the highest risk for them are, and we need to help them to understand what these risks potentially will be. So building resilience, how do we build resilience with our cities in the network? We try to empower cities to institutionalize resilience through a dedicated chief resilience officer. And you will see, like, for example, if you go to Athens, a city who has been very active to work on heat waves, that the chief resilience officer is also the chief heat officer, because the city prioritizes urban heat as one of the major priorities for the future. So all the cities in our network have established a resilience office. That means that there is a dedicated government official who coordinates and encourages the work on urban resilience within the city. So that means that we are not working in a specific department, in a specific silo, but we recognize that building urban resilience requires a cross-sectoral and cross-departmental kind of approach. And with the chief resilience officers and their teams and the cities, we developed resilience strategies. At the moment, we have 82 resilience strategies published. You can access them on our webpage. There you can see what are the cities prioritizing, what are the shocks and stresses they believe they are facing in future. We are establishing communities of practice. We have an urban heat community of practice where cities discuss with each other and with their peers how they can solve for that, and try to get a better understanding on solutions. Because for them, it's very clear that cities learn from cities, much more than cities learning from other organizations who come from the outside. And I think that's something we believe is important to leverage. We are mobilizing impact on the ground, which means we are implementing a number of multi-city programs. So cities are working with cities and us and partners to solve for certain resilience challenges they identified. And we drive investment into cities to solutions that help them build urban resilience. So what is the value of resilience and resilience planning? And I think we heard it a lot. One particular part is we want to avoid losses. So losses in the sense of losses of homes, losses of lives. That is, we want to be better prepared for what's going to come. But that means we are narrowing ourselves down. So I think what we are trying to do in working with our chief resilience officers trying to do, it's not only about being prepared for the next disaster. It's about being prepared for the disaster while at the same time think about how can we be better prepared, but while we are doing that and thinking about the solutions, also create co-benefits that make us stronger in the long run, and that allow us to tackle multiple crises or existing stresses and get more sustainable and have a brighter outlook into the future. So what we are trying to do is that clearly it's about avoiding losses whenever you look at a certain shock or stress, but it's also about how can we build the resilience of the systems and leverage social and economic and environmental benefits. And then that became specifically important in the last 2 years with the economic impact. So how can we do that in the same way that we are better prepared for the next heat wave, but we can also say that we can look at how can interactions be designed in a way that economic development is fostered, that we can create jobs. And a very, very important part all across the world, no matter if it's Africa, North America, or Europe, is the angle about equity, because usually we have vulnerable parts of the population we need to think very purposefully about. And then the other thing is it's about relationships. It's about relationships with organizations like the Red Cross. So how am I working with people and organizations who know a lot better how to set up a treatment plant if a crisis hits, but also about how are we creating these partnerships that we don't have to do anything on our own, but we also build our own capacity. So I think this is very important, because it's not either the city sorting the crisis or the Red Cross sorting the crisis. It's something we have to do together. And everybody, like Reinhold put it very, very clearly, you need specialists for certain things. This is not expertise that sits in the city, but the city needs to know, where do I go if I need something, and these relationships need to be built. So looking at it from an investment angle, what the city has been doing is that when we're thinking about resilience, we need to think about how we can build resilience to create a triple dividend. And that means we need to develop the local economy, we need to improve equity, and we need to prepare the communities for inevitable climate threats. So these are the very important changes. We cannot ignore climate change. It's going to happen. The impacts are felt. We have a lot of weaknesses in cities around the world because they are not equitable. We have vulnerable communities. We have a lot of poverty. We have a lot of still structural racism in a lot of areas where people are not treated equally, and that is highlighted by access to service and infrastructure in cities like even Boston, like cities, or like what we have seen during the Black Lives Matter movement in the US, where I think it's a global issue and not just a global South issue. So I would like to talk a little bit about the examples we are seeing and how cities are trying to build resilience based on what we heard around the shocks and stresses we are focusing on. So Rotterdam has built what they call the water plazas, and the water plazas initially are an infrastructure development to support drainage in the city when it's raining too much. So it's a problem, it's a solution that addresses flooding, but flooding is not happening 24 hours and 7 days a week. It happens sometimes. So what about the infrastructure? What is happening to the infrastructure if it's not raining? So, and I think this is what resilience planning looks like. So what the city did is they knew that they need to have a retention basin for rainwater to reduce flooding. But they also knew that in this specific Lake neighborhood, which you see on the top right, is that they had a lot of problems with migration. They had a lot of problems with social cohesion, low income families who didn't have a place to interact. Kids didn't have a place to play. So what they did is they designed a water plaza which acts as a football field or a playing field or a place where you can meet and sit when the sun is shining and when it's not raining. But when it's raining, it fills up and it becomes a retention basin. This is resilience planning in practice, because it means you're better prepared if something happens. But if that is not happening, and that's many times in the year, it allows to use the infrastructure in a different way, and it addresses some very, very important aspects which the city identified as a challenge, meaning a high migration population, low social cohesion in certain parts of the city, and that was addressed in a specific way with one solution. These are the solutions we would like to see from our cities. I'm giving an example which has nothing to do with flooding or urban heat waves, because one thing we are seeing about climate impacts is also that the ones where you get wet feet or where you start sweating are the ones which are that you feel them, and you also feel them in the sense of, like, flooding is always devastating with regard to losses and damages we are seeing to houses. The drought in South Africa was something which was a massive disaster in a very different way, but caused a lot of trouble. And from from the work we are seeing with our cities, water scarcity is going to be one of the major crises we have to prepare for in the future. So the Cape Town Water Fund was established as a solution where the city has been recognizing we need to do something about our basins. And they have been working with communities actually outside the city boundary to reduce invasive species to feed into the groundwater and to the groundwater supply. So that is another resilience solution which was targeted about bringing people into employment while at the same time solving for water crisis. One urban heat example which relates to what Catalina was saying, the city of Athens with the city of Rotterdam and Milan developed an app which allows people during heat waves to access cooling places. So you can download it. If you're in the city, if you need to cool down during a heat wave, you can access heat data. You know where to go. The city is managing that. So trying to provide space for people to get into a shelter that is a pleasant place to be. So what do we need to do in the future? I think we need to be prepared, and we need to understand that we are planning for something we have no idea what is going to happen in the future. So that is one part. We need to acknowledge that we don't have all the answers to that. We need to think about systems and interactions and cascading impacts. We need to build projects and investments in a different way that allows us to be better prepared, but also create these co-benefits. We need to understand that we cannot work in silos anymore, but that is an issue that needs to be addressed across whole city governments with the partners. And we need to be clear who our vulnerable populations are and how we are designing projects and interventions for them specifically. So there is a need to have an explicit focus on equity and inclusion in no matter what we are doing, because the poor sometimes are, or often are, less prepared than the rich ones. And that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Katrin. That was super interesting, and it's not necessarily what we are used to see from humanitarian perspective, and really great examples of building urban resilience from a long-term urban planning perspective also. And again, highlighting that neither humanitarians nor city governments nor any other given actor will solve all those problems alone, but we can only do that together, and everybody can solve a piece of it. And I also found it quite encouraging to see, like, if you start addressing one problem, you can try to see how you can, using that as an entry point, can address several problems at the same time, which I think is something we need to look much more at finding solutions that solve multiple problems at a time. I'm very conscious of time. I think we might even be kicked out of the session at 11 exactly, but I would still like to try and take the questions that we got from the floor. And the first one was actually to Reinhold, asking, from your experience, Reinhold, where should we focus urban humanitarian response for the most impact? Is it more supporting systems or communities directly, or a combination, or like your take?
Yeah, thank you, Cecilia. And thanks for the question. I think it's not an either or answer. We need to take both into account. In general, we need to look at the people that we are supporting. So we talked about individual vulnerabilities that we need to address, but we also need the backbone of the supporting system. So we also need to make sure that infrastructure is resilient. We need to make sure that response has the material backbone it needs, but the focus should be on the individuals that are affected. I hope that answers it very quickly.
I hope so too. I think so. I mean, it seems to me obvious it's not an either or, but absolutely we have to do both. And maybe different actors are focusing on different priority groups. But we also have a question to Katrin, and that was where to find the contacts of the resilience officers if humanitarians want to contact in their city to be more in connection with the city network and try to support those efforts.
So you can access most of the information through our webpage, and I hope that my colleague Fitz is sharing the links. So you can get in contact with us, and we are happy to provide the contacts. Otherwise, you find the names of the chief resilience officers on the homepage as well. We are very happy to help establishing that contact, because our resilience officers are in contact with the disaster risk reduction or the organizations who are dealing with disasters in a city, because it's an essential part of urban resilience.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Yeah, it seems to me that those resilience officers is really a capacity very much needed, because we talked about the need for more coordination, and someone needs to have an overview of all the things happening. And it's probably not exaggerated to have that dedicated capacity to do that. Yeah, I think we're spot on. Remains to thank you all for being here with me, for your excellent presentations. I hope for the public there has been some insights, maybe something new, some new thoughts, and of course the call to really join forces and build those coalitions and start those partnerships and really start working together across silos, across sectors, and like that we hopefully can be better prepared for the future that we are awaiting. Thank you very much, everybody, and hopefully to see you sometime in live.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thanks.